All right, fair enough. Thanks very much for putting that in perspective as to what's happening within that universe of electric two-wheelers and how these companies now have to ensure that they give refunds to the customers who have bought these. And of course, the FAME 2 subsidy is the one that we're talking about, which we have seen wrong claims on that kind of subsidy. Now, let's talk about the festive season. It's still a few weeks away, and retailers and restaurateurs, meanwhile, they're pinning their hopes on festive season, on Diwali and Christmas, for a kind of recovery in demand. But meanwhile, from apparel to footwear to even quick service restaurants, QSRs like we know them, businesses are finding it tough to attract customers right now because we have price rises, we have inflation. We have some quotes on your screens right now. These are top Indian businessmen. Only this evening, the RBI's Bulletin 2, like we discussed, has acknowledged that inflation will be well above 6% in the September quarter. So now the question is, where will the customers come from? Will they have the kind of deep pockets that they require to be able to manage the price rise and ensure that discretionary spends don't take a hit? Let's find out. Anurag Kathriyar is founder at Indigo Hospitality. He joins us along with Mithali Nikore, the founder and economist over at Nikore Associates. Both, thank you very much for making the time and joining us on India Tonight. Anurag, to you first. You run a restaurant chain. You tell us, you've been in the restaurant business for a very long time. What is your assessment of the demand situation right now? Are Indians choosing to eat out as much as they did pre-pandemic? Or are they avoiding it in recent times to save expenses?
No, in fact, when I was listening to you, I was a little surprised because the past weekend, which was a little longish weekend with the Independence Day and other things, has been a very, very good period for the F&B industry overall.
Is it?
Of course, 15th August being a dry day, the revenues drop, but that's every year. But the number of people coming out has been quite good. So overall, I think it's there is nothing which is showing that there is signs of people not coming out to consume at the restaurants. So I don't know, maybe there is some data somewhere, maybe certain rural pockets may have seen that. But by and large, in the urban pockets, we have actually seen good numbers in last couple of weeks.
Where does the truth lie? As an economist, Mithali, what's your reading? Because sometimes there is this, it doesn't quite add up. What we're seeing on the ground, what we're experiencing on the ground, but what the data indicates. So what is the current economic situation vis-a-vis inflation? The RBI, of course, started off with its rate hikes to control rising prices. And of course, that was a global phenomenon. Central banks around the world were doing it after the pandemic. The impact of this rate hike that we've seen playing out would happen with a lag is what many economists told us about, where it controls demand within the economy. Is that what is happening right now? Is that what the data is suggesting, where this lag effect is playing out and we are seeing demand take a dip? Why do you suspect the great Indian middle class is holding back on discretionary spends like the data is suggesting, like buying of clothes or footwear or even on eating out?
So I think, Vikram, we often try to look at the Indian consumer as a homogeneous category. And I think that's the first step where we are making a mistake. As we are analyzing, we have to look at Indian demand with different segments. We can segment by city, say, for example, tier 1 versus tier 2 versus tier 3. Or we can actually segment by income categories. We can segment by gender, where are women spending, where are men spending. So I think when we look at the different segments, then, the aggregate numbers will start to make sense. So, for example, what my colleague might be experiencing might be a higher demand driven by household consumption and families, on a particular holiday weekend, which belong to maybe, middle class or upper middle class, I would say, and also the well-to-do. On the other hand, when we look at the fact that we may have experienced a K-shaped recovery post-COVID, there are many households which used to be middle class but are struggling. And, in the new classification would not be middle class. And they are the ones probably who are cutting down on consumption in many areas. Again, you will see that consumption cut down is happening in leisure categories, something which is discretionary as opposed to something which is essential. So maybe you don't need to buy, one more sari as a woman. So you start to see that on the retail side and on the cosmetic side and businesses like that will start to see the first hit. And it's often the women in the family who cut down on their leisure consumption to start with.
Yes.
So I think we have to analyze these trends from the different segments, and then the overall aggregates will start to make sense.
Would you agree, Anurag? Because there is a certain market that you cater to, perhaps at a lower strata of the economy. We're talking about the middle class over here, perhaps not the kind of customer base that you cater to. But I was looking at a quotation by Ravi Jaipuria as well, the non-executive chairman of Devyani International, and they run chains like Costa, etc. And he's saying that high inflation across industries and categories has led to this short-term impact on consumer sentiment and demand in the last few quarters, especially when you look at April to June. Perhaps this is the quarter where we've seen the maximum price rise when it comes to vegetables, and of course that pinches the pocket to such an extent that it plays out on other kinds of discretionary spends. And do you agree that this is what is at play right now? There are different segments within an economy, and certain parts of the stratas of society, they get hit much harder.
No, see, well, I'm not an economist, but I think what you are saying, Vikram, is making logical sense. Obviously, there'll be a certain class which will be insulated, and there'll be a certain class which will be feeling the pinch of the inflation. See, one cannot deny there is an overall inflation, and the cost of livelihood has gone up. There is no denying that. Maybe, there could be a play of, certain segments still being insulated to it, and certain sector feeling a bigger pinch. For example, by and large, the organized restaurant sectors are not impacted with the price inflation because they largely have annual rate contracts for supplies. So it is not making a huge difference to organized sector. But when you look at the organized sector, which doesn't have rate contracts and who do like virtually daily purchases, they must be feeling the heat. So yes, there are two worlds which exist.
When you talk about the restaurant business in particular, how do you manage price rise? There are input costs and those could eat into margins. How do you mitigate the risks of inflation in the economy that impacts demand, maybe not directly, but to a certain extent, and perhaps to some of the other restaurants, like I was talking about the QSR space, and we are seeing that kind of delays in spending decisions where Nykaa is concerned as well, because we've heard from Falguni Nair. She speaks about April to June being an odd quarter where companies fail to do anything to spike consumer interest. It almost felt like the customers went missing. So there is a certain cyclicality associated with this kind of phenomenon as well. Isn't it, Anurag, something that you would have experienced in the restaurant business too?
Yes, perhaps, but you must also understand the sector that I represent is probably the lowest hanging fruit for a discretionary expenditure. Right. If there is something to celebrate, the first thing people say is, let's go out and eat. And that's why probably we are not feeling the pinch as much as probably the other retail. For example, you mentioned about footwear. You mentioned about some other, like the lady mentioned about an additional sari, maybe, decision to be put off. I think that is totally understandable. But by and large, how do we manage inflation right now? Because of rate contracts, it's not impacting us as much. I mean, the great tomato story we have all heard of. And yes, there is a little bit of input cost which has gone up. But tomatoes, for example, if you're running an Asian restaurant, tomato doesn't even matter in your life. If you're running a Western cuisine restaurant, maybe a little bit. If you're running a hardcore Indian, maybe a little more. So it is very segmented right now. And I may tend to agree with you that different segments are reacting differently to the current inflationary trends.
Of course, to maintain volumes, to maintain the kind of turnover is something that every company that is in the consumption sector is going to try hard to maintain. Mithali, like we were discussing, controlling demand to control prices, it becomes the prerogative of the RBI. Naturally, of course, growth is going to take a hit to some extent. How long do you see the impact of restrained demand playing out in certain parts of the economy? Are certain parts going to take longer? And is the festive season likely to change that if you just look at it as a cyclical kind of phenomenon?
So I think, Vikram, how these impacts will play out is a little bit, we have to wait a little bit to see, because in my view, the third quarter and the fourth quarters will pretty much make up for the April to June quarter. That's my reading. Because, when we're seeing the trends in consumption spending, we are looking at April to June in this analysis. But when we start looking at the July to September and October, especially the October to December quarter, we will start to see a very different picture emerging, where you might see consumption spending rising despite the measures to control inflation. So I do believe that we'll start to see consumption spending go up. It always does in the second half of the year. The second aspect that we have to think about is, why is it that we are reliant on such a small section of our population to always drive this consumption spending? Why are we not doing more to spread the benefits of growth amongst different sections of the economy? And I think there, we have to do a lot more on the macroeconomic structural measures for redistribution, for income inequality, for looking at how can we support the middle class and, the poor, so that we are not just a consumption-driven economy of consumption of the top 10%, income earners, but rather a consumption-driven economy in a broad sense, with a broader base, so that you become a more resilient consumption-driven economy.
Why? Yes, absolutely, Mithali. It is a question of why it hasn't happened. And to answer that as well, we have to turn to economists like you, who would kind of draft policies or help the government draft better policies where there is that kind of uniform approach to dealing with problems and making sure that whenever there is a hit on the economy, not one particular segment bears the brunt over others. We'll have to see how that happens. But of course, after the pandemic, there is a bit of that YOLO effect that is playing out, and people don't want to hold back spends on indulgence. Anurag, you want to quickly address that because, when it comes to an indulgence and discretionary kind of spends, the approach has changed, hasn't it? And it would work out for your business differently.
Yes, initially I thought that there was only a short-term revenge consumption that was happening in the industry just after the lockdown was lifted. But very clearly, it has sustained itself pretty well. I can tell you that the weekend numbers that we are clocking today are far better than what we were clocking pre-pandemic. Weekday numbers are still a little on the slower side than what it was, but nothing very significant. So I think overall, the consumption is going up. People are in that thing, okay, with all the uncertainties we have seen around COVID, I think maybe there is a little bit of that factor. Let's go and enjoy whatever we have.
Well, we hope at the end of the day, everything works out well. And this is a short-term phenomenon, this kind of dip in demand, and that everyone is able to enjoy better. And yes, the company's margins, they remain intact as well in times to come. Anurag Khatriyar, Mithali Nikore, thanks very much for joining us with your perspective on India Tonight.
Thank you.